Slugfields, luxury prison. I knew it must be the end of the world because there were twigs in the toilet. Things had been strange for a while. There was no winter. Days burned like the desert, or torrential rain washed whole streets away. Birds fell out of the sky. Slugs grew to the size of humans and applied for jobs at local councils. The strangest thing was that none of this sent people into the streets screaming. We just accepted it. It was as if a magic sleeping spell had been cast over the kingdom and people just carried on as normal. I couldn't explain the twigs in the toilet. There was something about the wild, lawless desperation of it that didn't make any sense. They floated in the water in a threatening, fecal fashion. It was just another thing falling apart. The twigs in the toilet bobbed around in my head as if my head was now the toilet bowl. I wondered how long it would be before they were flushed through my system and I could think about normal things again, like what to have for lunch and what time was too early for lunch. I lived alone with my cat called Susan, who was a ginger tabby. She could walk, talk, and was the same size as a human. She had retained the elements of cat life insofar as she was excessively lazy and selfish and relied on me to feed and shelter her. She lay on the sofa brushing her hair and watching TV, but would go out on secretive nighttime jaunts and wouldn't tell me what she did. Once I found a packet of never-touched cat milk cigarette factory matches down the side of the sofa, the day after a reported arson attack on the Houses of Slug Parliament. However, I didn't complain or ask too many questions, as I was grateful for her company, and she never ridiculed my ambition to be an artist. I had mixed feelings about the end of the world. I hadn't been doing so great in the normal world. I'd sort of fallen behind, was hanging around the edges of what was considered a good and normal life. Work-wise, things had been a bit dry for a long time. There wasn't much demand for art in a collapsing society, not even cat pictures. But I had a meeting lined up with the big cheese from the cat milk cigarette factory. They had seen one of my drawings of Susan watching TV and had made contact. The cat milk cigarette factory was one of the last functioning businesses, and a commission with them could prove to be a lifeline to some kind of stability. This might be the big break that I was waiting for, and I had been in a state of nervous anticipation for days. I had just made myself a cup of coffee, mainly mud with a tiny bit of cocaine, as real coffee was now an expensive luxury, when there was a loud knock at the door. This was strange, as I didn't have many visitors. Before I could say "come in," the door fell off its hinges, and a huge neon slug wobbled its way into the room.
"You are under arrest for making derogatory slug art," said the slug. "Come along quietly now, let's have no trouble."
There must be some mistake. I merely draw slugs with lipstick on.
"I'm just following orders," said the slug.
Surely you can use your common sense. What harm does a picture of a slug with lipstick on do? I said.
"It's not for me to say. I'm just doing my job,"
said the slug, and it put me in a headlock and locked some slimy handcuffs on me. I was placed in the back of a van in a compartment smaller than a toilet cubicle. My knees were touching the wall. Through the tiny window I could see daily life continuing, but now we were separated as if they were on TV. I could hear noises from the other compartments, snufflings, muffled sobs and bangings. We eventually arrived at some huge gates and were driven in. I glimpsed a sign saying, "Slugfields, luxury prison." I wondered who would feed my cat while I was away, and if I would make it out in time for my important meeting.
"Welcome to Slugfields Luxury Prison," said the slug on reception. "Here is your luxury grey tracksuit, 5 pairs of luxury knickers, and a slug slop bowl. You have been allocated a luxury cell,"
said the receptionist. I was pleased at the thought of the luxury cell, but when I looked at the threads coming off the luxury knickers, I experienced a feeling of misgiving. I tried to tell the slug that there had been a terrible mistake, and I shouldn't really be here, but their face hardened, and they said,
"That's not for me to say. I just give out knickers."
I was taken down endless long corridors lined with blue doors. There was banging and shouting from behind the doors, but I could see nobody. The sounds echoed and bounced off the hard surfaces, multiplying them.
"This is your luxury cell," said the slug.
It was as if by saying it over and over it would make it true. The slug opened the door and gave me a little push on the back to get me in. The door slammed shut behind me. It took me a minute to realise that I wasn't alone in the cell. A large, lumpy mass was on the top bunk. It shifted slightly and let out a long sigh. The TV in the corner blared out an episode of Slug Island, where slugs lay on the sun loungers and talked about who they would like to slug off with out of the other sexy slug contestants. The neon light from the TV was to be a permanent fixture, as my cellmate refused to turn it off and was always watching out of one eye, even when I thought they were asleep. I was glad to see that there was a phone inside the cell. Hopefully I could call my cat and tell her what had happened, but when I picked up the phone, all I could hear was someone burping and no ringtone. There was definitely nothing luxury about the cell. After a few days in Slugfields luxury prison, I started to lose track of time. Intermittently, a stabbing fear ran through my body that I would never be able to leave, but mostly it was just monotonous, with small daily challenges that were overly complicated by prison bureaucracy. Trying to get any basic information went round in circles, with contradictory advice. You could request a human grooming pack, or a hume groom, as the slugs called it, which included normal things like toothpaste, toothbrush, hairbrush, etc. The slugs didn't really like you to have this, as they were jealous of the human ability to grow hair, and considered a small stick adequate for teeth and hair. They had learnt this from some sort of Victorian workhouse manual. They would make any excuse not to give you the pack, and responses to the request range from shocked surprise to outraged indignation to exasperated dismissal. They would slug off in a huff, and you would have to ask the next one who came along, like a slug lottery. For days I thought nothing was happening, and had just resolved myself to a slow decline when the door of the cell opened and an arm threw a hume groom pack into the room, slamming it shut behind them. Using the pencil and paper in the pack, I wrote a long letter to Susan explaining the situation I found myself in, telling her how to use the oven, describing where the emergency tins were hidden, giving coded details about my secret stash of savings so that she could buy food for herself, and ending with declarations of my love and undying affection. I found out later that the postbox went directly into a shredder, and the shreds went down a chute into the kitchen, ending up in the slug slop. Slug slop was served 3 times a day from a hole in the wall, which we lined up for. It was a gloopy, yellow sort of soup, which the slugs claimed contained all your daily required vitamins and minerals. For slugs, perhaps it did. The cell smelt permanently of slug farts. My cellmate just lay on their bed watching the TV. An endless stream of episodes meant that there was never a quiet moment in the small room. A lot of the time I stuffed toilet paper in my ears to block out some of the noise, but only succeeded in dulling it somewhat. The only programme I liked was Antique Slug Show, where the slugs would show off their human antiques that they had improved by covering with slug slime, and the presenter would tell them how much they had increased the value by. The presenter would always say exorbitant figures, and the slugs would be delighted and start talking about the luxury holidays they would go on. One of the worst was Come Dine with Slugs, where they got a human to have dinner with slugs. It would start quite civilised, with talk about the differences between slug and human culture, but would usually end with the slugs eating the human. I closed my eyes at this point and did some deep breathing. Sometimes I thought about the twigs in the toilet and pretended that I was just a twig bobbing around. Compared to my current life, the vision of the floating twigs was quite soothing. The cell door had a small slit in it that looked into the central corridor of faceless blue doors. I would spend a lot of time looking out of this window. It was a great alternative to the TV and was our only contact with the world outside our 4 walls. Not much happened, but whenever anyone came past, I would kick the door a bit and shout, "I've got an important meeting to get to!" Or, "Who will feed my cat?" for a bit of variety. But everyone ignored me. I was just another voice shouting words that they didn't care about. I knew my life outside was crumbling, but was powerless to do anything about it. I got a job digging out lumps of neon yellow dirt at the back of the exercise yard. We weren't sure what it was for, but it got put into big tubs saying "floopy" and got taken away once a week in a van. We were each given a twig to dig with. The twigs were doled out and counted back in at the end of the day. It seemed excessive control as they were only twigs, but part of the system of Slugfields was to remove any kind of autonomy or independence from the prisoners with pointless, endless, humiliating rules. One day, on a day very much like all the others, I found another twig as I was digging in the dirt. It must have blown in from somewhere, as there were very few trees left in the world, and none at all at Slugfields. At the end of the shift, I stuffed one twig up the sleeve of my grey tracksuit and handed in the other to the slug in charge. I walked back to my cell, finally understanding the phrase, heart in your mouth, feeling like the slugs could see right through me. I wasn't sure what I would do with my stick, but I knew I had to have it. It was a grasping of straws, a needle in a haystack, a carrot or a stick. It was my talisman. I had got my bowl of slug slop and was settling in for a torturous episode of Come Dine with Slugs. It had just got to the bit where the slugs turn on the human when a siren went off. My already jangled nerves took another hit, and I slopped my bowl of slug slop down my luxury grey t-shirt. The corridor became alive with slugs rushing up and down, shouting, doors banging, keys jangling. My cellmate shifted in their bunk, sighed and farted. The banging of doors was coming down the corridor. I tried to listen to the shouts. "Inspection!" came the cries. They were turning out each cell, one by one. They were looking for something. My heart sank into my luxury plimsolls. What if they found my twig? Was that what they were looking for? The slugs would be furious at an infringement of the rules. I would have no hope of getting out. I held the twig in my hand like a wand and tried to do a magic spell with it. Nothing happened. I looked around the cell for a way to dispose of it. There was no way to open the window, nowhere to hide it. I couldn't eat it. Apart from the door, the only aperture in and out of the cell was the toilet. Panic rising as the banging of cell doors got closer and closer, I began to break the twig into smaller pieces. I dropped the pieces into the toilet bowl and flushed, but they didn't go down. I stood and stared at the pieces, swirling and bobbing around.